Okay. Hello Vermont history students, and welcome to the video for Unit 10 of the course. And this unit has two parts. One goes from the 1940s to the 1950s, and then the second one covers the 1960s, what generally historians refer to as the Hoff years, when Phil Hoff was governor. And this is the pivotal era when modern Vermont truly came into being. And as far as housekeeping goes, is that about right? First of all, I need to keep this video short because the one I made on Monday was 15 minutes long and YouTube didn't like it. There's some housekeeping. The number one main thing is that on Friday, I'll write you an email about this, but on Friday I am going to be driving to a cottage that I own in Ontario, and I will do the rest of the course from my cottage in Ontario. So that means it's a 10-hour drive, so all day Friday will be caught up with that drive. On Saturday I will go respond to the discussion questions, and I hope that people will be very patient about that. And then next week I'll be making our videos and responding to questions from Ontario. The papers, some of you have 2 papers in. Of course, you're required to give me 3. Get them to me by next Friday, not this Friday, but next Friday, or else you'll get an incomplete, and then that won't get resolved for a while, unfortunately, but I just won't be around. So a lot of you have given me 2 papers already. I'm eager to get a third. I assume a lot of papers will roll in at the end of this week, and I'll try to grade them on Saturday or Sunday and have your comments back to you by Monday at the latest, so then you have the whole week in order to write your last paper. Also on July 1st, the website is changing because of the NVU merger thing coming to its maturity, and hopefully that's not going to disrupt the course in any way. So that's, I think, all the housekeeping. So here, so there's 2 parts to this section, right? And the first part is about the 40s and the 50s. And that's a really interesting, it's a fascinating era. It's like a little twilight zone in Vermont between what the old Vermont dying was and what the new Vermont coming into being will be. The old traditional economy really begins to be on its last legs in this era. And if you just think about this, at the time of World War II, there were about 26,000 dairy farms in Vermont, and by the time you get to the mid-1960s, there's 9,600. And there's a variety of reasons for that. The trend already by World War II had been for larger, fewer farms, bigger herds. There's an economy of scale that goes on there. And it is a thing about how, you know, that in the Gilded Age, in the 1880s, downhillers farmed in downhill ways, scientific and on a logical, you know, most recent practices. And uphillers farmed small farms well tilled. And then they reverse. Uphillers have to farm in the most modern ways just to survive, and downhillers farm organically on a small scale because it's cool. But if you think about the loss of that many dairy farms, 15,000 dairy farms, 17,000 dairy farms, if each farm has 5 people on it, 5 people, whatever, you're talking about the displacement of 75,000 people in a state of about 400,000 people. And so what's going to happen to all those people? It's an enormous change. The textile industry is going out. The Quechee Mill and the Queen City Cotton Mill and the Winooski Mill, all those closed in the 1950s. Timber has basically been out. Stones, you know, extractive quarrying, those are dying. And so there's this whole old infrastructure of the economy that supported uphill life that is going away. And the question is, what's going to replace it? And where's Vermont going to go after that? And a model that I gave you on the website is a story of this woman named Susie Wilson. And Susie Wilson, there's this road called Susie Wilson Road in Essex. I lived in Essex for 10 years while I was teaching at UVM, and it was the worst traffic ever. But I wondered, who's Susie Wilson? And so it turns out Susie Wilson was this farm wife who had a farm right next to Fort Ethan Allen in Essex. And Essex in the 1930s, during World War II, was a rural dairy town. It was a small town. The big town, for a while, Rutland was the biggest town in Vermont, bigger than Burlington, you know, but the demise of Rutland, because of the demise of Marble, is one of the sort of models of the old economy going out. So Susie Wilson used to have, during World War II, a lot of soldiers were stationed at Fort Ethan Allen, and they would go to her house for dinner on weekends. But the rumor got out that Susie Wilson was a prostitute and ran a brothel, and that she would bring young women from Westford and Fairfax in to service the soldiers. And of course, uphillers knew whether this was true or not, and downhillers didn't. She was very uphill. And then the war ended and the soldiers left and Susie Wilson died. And then as a replacement for the old economy, the guy who ran IBM, Tom Watson, skied at Stowe, and some businessmen in Burlington, the Greater Burlington Industrial Corporation, persuaded Watson to put an IBM plant in Essex. Why do you put it there? Because there's such a high quality of life in Vermont and workers will be happy there. So they put the IBM plant there in the late 50s, and then Essex blew up, and then you have all the problems that they had in New York and New Jersey, where IBM used to be, with the traffic and the need for bigger schools and bigger waste treatment plants, all those things. And now Essex is the second biggest town in all of Vermont. And so IBM, it's great. I liked living in Essex. Essex is a nice town. But the thing is that the uphillers were driven out. And so there were people who knew if Susie Wilson actually was a prostitute. But they're all gone. And uphillers weren't going to tell downhillers their secrets anyway. But there's no chance of finding out the truth of that mystery, because there's no one left who has any memory of it. So that's kind of a metaphor for the state as a whole. The same thing goes for this town Landgrove that I'm writing a book about. And I don't know if I've emphasized that story too much or too little. But what happened is Landgrove was this dying nothing of a town down in southern Vermont. And then this guy Sam Ogden moved there in 1930 from New Jersey. Fixed up the village first, fixed up the houses, sold them to his wealthy friends from New Jersey, and it became this wonderful artist colony with musicians, famous artists, and more of the houses got bought up. And there were the Swedes that Valentine had brought in 1890, and some of them still remained. Certainly they were there in 1930. Most of their kids had gone off to places like Brattleboro and White River Junction and Arlington, places where there were industrial jobs. And Landgrove became this really fancy town. And then in the 50s, it exploded with skiing as becoming a vacation place. Bromley was in place already by the late 1930s and then got bigger. And then Stratton and Magic Mountain both started in the 1950s, and Killington's not that far away. So by the time you get to the 1950s, there's really just one of the Swedes left, a guy named Alve Nielsen, running a dairy farm. But on the whole, Landgrove is this fancy town. And that is a metaphor for the state as a whole. I mean, is there a place for uphillers in modern Vermont as we move forward? And one thing you're looking at is seeing is that the residential patterns are completely switching. In the 1880s, the uphillers lived in the small uphill farming towns, and the downhillers lived in the urban centers. And what's gradually happening is the residential patterns are reversing. The downhillers want to live in big houses in the country, and because the uphillers can't afford to live in those places anymore, and because there's no jobs and there's no dairy farming on the whole, they move to the urban centers where they're, White River Junction and Brattleboro and Burlington and St. Johnsbury. So the downhillers are in the uphill towns and areas, and the uphillers are in the downhill areas. It's Vermont. And that's all compounded enormously then by the interstates. And the interstate highway system is really truly this huge dividing line, and people knew it was going to be huge, and that it was going to be a difference between the old Vermont and the new Vermont. Vermont's going to be within a day's drive of 80 million people on the East Coast. And it's going to go from this rural backwater with lousy roads and isolation to this place that's opened up to the rest of the world. And the question was, are Vermonters going to be in control of the state's destiny, or are outsiders going to determine its destiny, its future? So that gets you to the 1960s. And the second part really revolves around this guy whose name was Phil Hoff. And Phil Hoff was a Democrat, and no Democrat had been governor of Vermont since before the Civil War, in over 100 years. And Hoff was a lawyer from Massachusetts who moved to Burlington. He served in the legislature first, in the House, and again, representing Burlington, he had the same one vote as someone from a town like Baltimore or Andover or Holland, Vermont, which really is kind of crazy, although uphillers loved it. That's the old one town, one house, one vote, one town, one vote apportionment. Hoff got elected. Things lined up correctly for him, and first thing he did was say, we need to study this state. There's this huge lack of information. The state's being run like it's still the 1880s. And so he did all these, he had all these study focus groups. The one that was on preservation of scenery was actually run by Sam Ogden, the guy from Landgrove, who was a conservative guy who did not like government, big government, government interference and all that, but yet he served on all these boards. He had been on the Development Commission, he had founded Vermont Life magazine, he had done all these things, and he didn't want regulation, but he knew that Vermont needed regulation, and then he complained about the regulation that he helped put in place. And that's the divided line to Vermont. You know, we want Vermont to be an uphill state, but in order to make it uphill, downhillers need to regulate it and order it and standardize it and all these things. And so, but Hoff couldn't get very much done early on in his governorship because it was a one-town, one-vote legislature. The uphillers didn't like him. And then in 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Vermont's apportionment was stupid and ridiculously anti-democratic, and ordered the House to reorganize itself, reapportion itself by population. And people will tell you that reapportionment was the huge dividing line between the old and the new Vermont. They cut the legislature from 246 seats, one for each town, to 150. And the state now, after reapportionment, had a much more urban, a much more professional, a much more downhill look to it. And a lot of small towns that had always sent people to the legislature never would have people in the legislature ever again. And of course, Chittenden County was the biggest beneficiary of that, because so much of the population increasingly was living there. So then after reapportionment, Hoff could get a lot more done, and Hoff began to do lots more studies and recommended that if Vermont was going to be in control of its own future, the Vision and Choice document is on Moodle, it would have to do a lot more regulation. If Vermont was going to remain this scenic, idyllic, beautiful place and not be overly run over by outsiders, it would have to act. And he left the office in 1968 and was replaced by a Republican, Dean Davis. But Dean Davis was an environmentalist too, and Dean Davis shepherded through the House Act 250. And Act 250 is a controversial but comprehensive land use law that has 10 criteria. There's districts around Vermont, and then there's criteria that you have to get a pass in order to get a permit to build. Its effect on the scenery, its effect on water, its effect on roads, its effect on local services, etc. Uphillers don't like Act 250 on the whole. It's a bit of a stereotype, but it's true. Uphillers think Act 250 infringes on their freedoms. But if you don't have it, then Vermont will become like New Jersey. And I like New Jersey, I like living there, but we don't want Vermont to become New Jersey. And so that's the problem, and that's the thing. And Vermont by 1970 has become this hugely environmentalist state. And the question I have for you to cap off Unit 10 is the environmentalism a lesson that downhillers had to teach uphillers, or is it a lesson that downhillers learn from uphillers? And it is really important to understand where we are right now. So I'm looking forward to going back up and checking out the discussion for Unit 9. It's already been really good. On Friday, I will be driving to Muskoka. I will respond to your comments and grade your papers as soon as I can. And hopefully this video is not too long. Okay.